Do not cry in front of them. She swallowed. He looked at her and said 5 words. Do not cry in front of them. She swallowed her tears and watched them drag him away in chains, still wearing his wedding bandages. She had 3 days to save his life, and she started with the enemy's own daughter. But to understand how a virgin bride with 17 cents ended up fighting for a man's life in a town that wanted her gone, we need to go back. 11 days earlier, a woman with 17 cents in her pocket and a dead man's broken watch stands alone on a frozen street in a town where nobody knows her name. The stagecoach that brought her here just cracked its axle. The boarding house slammed the door in her face. Night is falling, the temperature is dropping below zero, and she has roughly 4 hours before the cold kills her. Then a stranger walks out of the general store. A man with a scar carved from his ear to his jaw and eyes that look like they have already buried everything worth loving. He says 5 words, I have got a cabin. She follows him into the dark, knowing that if he kills her tonight, no one on earth will come looking. But here is what she does not know. There are 2 graves behind that cabin, a wife and a baby, and hidden inside a wooden chest beneath 2 pairs of tiny unworn baby shoes is a letter that begins with the words, I am frightened of him. She just moved in with a man whose dead wife left a warning. And the worst part, she is carrying a secret of her own, one written in blood on a staircase floor 1,000 miles away. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. That scene, the fire, the burned hands, the kerosene smell sharp enough to strip paint, that comes later. 11 days later, to be exact. And when it comes, it will change everything. For now, let us go back. 11 days earlier, to the moment Clara Bennett arrived in a town that did not want her and discovered that the only person willing to help was the one person everyone else was afraid of. If this opening already has your heart racing, hit that like button right now and tell me in the comments, would you have followed the stranger into the dark? Share this story with someone who believes in second chances. And if you have not subscribed yet, tap that button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now let us ride into the night together. Clara Bennett had died once already, not in the way people usually mean it, not her heart stopping or her lungs giving out. She died standing in the upstairs hallway of a house in Pennsylvania, looking down a flight of stairs at the crumpled body of her stepfather, Walter Griggs, lying motionless at the bottom with blood pooling beneath his head and spreading across the wooden floor like something alive. She did not check if he was breathing. She did not call for help. She ran. Out to the window she had been climbing through when he grabbed her hair and yanked her backward. Out into the November darkness with nothing but 17 cents a carpet bag packed in secret 3 days earlier, and the broken pocket watch that had belonged to Daniel Hale, the man she had agreed to marry through a newspaper advertisement but had never once met face to face. The watch had stopped at 3:47 in the afternoon, the exact moment Daniel died in a copper mine in Colorado 6 months before Clara ever set foot on a westbound stagecoach. She did not know that when she packed it. She learned it later from a letter forwarded by the mine company delivered to a boarding house in St. Louis, where she had spent 2 nights sleeping on a chair because the bed cost extra. Now she stood on the main street of Willow Creek, Wyoming territory, November 1873, and tried to remember how to breathe. The wind hit her face like an open hand. It smelled of horse manure cut with wood smoke, and underneath that, the flat mineral scent of frozen earth. Somewhere down the street, a piano played in a saloon, one key badly out of tune, repeating the same sour note like a toothache that would not quit. She clutched her carpet bag against her chest. Inside it were 3 dresses, the broken pocket watch, a letter from Daniel Hale she had read 47 times on the journey west, and 17 cents in a small cloth purse. That was everything Clara Bennett owned in the world. Daniel's letter was the reason she was here, not love. She had never met the man, but his words, written in careful handwriting on cheap paper, had been the first kind words directed at her in longer than she could remember. I am not a man who is good with words, he had written, but I promise you a warm home and respect. That is all I have, and I give it freely. She had answered his advertisement not because she dreamed of romance on the frontier. She answered it because Walter Griggs, her stepfather, a man respected in church and feared behind closed doors, had begun looking at her in a way that made her understand with the clarity of an animal sensing a predator that if she did not leave, the only thing she had left to protect would be taken from her. Walter did not hit with fists. He controlled with words, with locked rooms, with silence so heavy it pressed the air from your lungs. And recently his control had shifted into something darker, something that lived in the way his eyes followed her across a room, the way his hand lingered when he passed her a plate at dinner, the way he stood too close and breathed too loud and smiled in a manner that had nothing to do with kindness. She ran. Daniel Hale was supposed to be her way out, a stranger in Colorado who wanted a wife and promised warmth and respect. Two things Clara had never had in the same sentence. But Daniel was dead before she reached him, killed by a collapsed mine shaft. And Clara had continued west anyway because going back to Pennsylvania meant going back to Walter Griggs, and she would rather freeze to death on a street in Wyoming than spend one more night under that roof. The stagecoach axle had cracked coming into town. She heard it before she felt it. A sound like a rifle shot followed by the whole coach lurching sideways and the driver cursing loud enough to scare the horses into a half gallop before he wrestled them still. Clara gripped the window frame and held on while her carpet bag slid across the bench and hit the far wall. When the dust settled and the driver climbed down, she already knew what he would say. She had spent 8 months learning to read bad news in the set of a man's shoulders, and the driver's shoulders said everything. "Axle is cracked clean through," he said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "We are done for today. Maybe tomorrow, maybe longer. Depends on the blacksmith. Depends on parts from Denver." Clara stood on the frozen street and calculated. She had no money for a hotel. She knew no one in this town. Silver Creek, where her cousin Martha ran a dress shop and had written 3 years ago that there would always be a place for family, was still 2 days of travel away. That letter was 3 years old. Martha might have moved or married or died, but it was all Clara had, and she had crossed half the country on the strength of it. The town stretched before her in a single line. Weathered buildings with paint peeling in long strips, a general store, a saloon, a feed and grain supply, a blacksmith shop where her broken stagecoach sat looking defeated, and at the far end, a white church steeple pointing toward a sky the color of old iron. She walked to the boarding house first. It sat on a side street behind a picket fence with lace curtains and a hand-painted sign that read rooms available, respectable ladies only. The woman who answered was thin as a fence post with gray hair pulled tight enough to stretch the skin at her temples. Her eyes moved over Clara the way a butcher examines a side of beef, calculating weight, estimating value. $2 a week. Cash in advance. No exceptions. Clara opened her mouth and closed it. $2. She had 17 cents. The distance between what she had and what she needed might as well have been the distance between the earth and the moon. The thing, as Clara said, and the words tasted like ashes. My stagecoach broke down unexpectedly, and I was not prepared for the extra expense. If I could perhaps arrange to pay when I reached Silver Creek. Cash only. The woman's expression did not change, did not soften, did not flicker with anything resembling sympathy. No credit extended. Breakfast included. Supper costs extra. No male visitors. "I'm afraid I do not have $2, Clara said, and the admission felt like pulling teeth with pliers. The door closed with a click that sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. Clara stood on the porch and felt something hard and bitter climbing her throat. She wanted to knock again, wanted to explain that she was not asking for charity, that she was a respectable woman who had simply run into bad luck. But she knew it would not matter. The woman behind that door had made her assessment in 5 seconds flat, and nothing Clara said would change it. She walked back toward Main Street as the afternoon light began to fail. The November sun hung low and pale, offering no warmth, only the promise of a cold night coming fast. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more desperate than the last. The church, the livery stable, the alley behind the general store, each option worse than the one before, and all of them ending the same way. Alone in the cold with 17 cents and the growing certainty that she had made a terrible mistake coming west. She stopped in front of the church. The door was locked. A sign read, "Services Sunday only. Reverend S. Hayes." She sat down on the steps and put her carpetbag in her lap and stared at the empty street. She had traveled 1,200 miles to reach a place where nobody was waiting for her. Now she sat on the steps of a locked church, and God, if he was in there, had bolted the door. The temperature dropped as the sun sank. Clara could feel the cold moving through her coat, through her dress, settling against her skin like a second layer of clothing made entirely of ice. She began calculating. How long could a person survive outside in this weather? She had read somewhere that hypothermia could kill in 4 to 6 hours. The sun would be fully down within the hour. That gave her until midnight, maybe 1 or 2 in the morning if she found shelter from the wind. She stood up. The livery stable. At least there would be straw and the body heat of horses. She picked up her carpet bag and started walking. She almost did not see the man coming out of the general store. He was carrying a crate stacked with supplies, and Clara was so lost in her own spiraling thoughts that she walked directly into his path. She stumbled. The crate shifted in his arms. Her carpet bag hit the boardwalk and burst open, spilling a cotton dress and the broken pocket watch onto the frozen dirt. She smelled him before she saw him properly. Tan leather and dried grass and something else she could not name. Coffee, maybe, or the particular scent of a man who spent his days working in open air far from other people. A hand caught her elbow, steadying her. The grip was firm and calloused, and it held her just long enough to make sure she was not going to fall and then released. Not a second longer than necessary. "You all right?" he said. His voice was low and rough. Not unfriendly, but unused. The voice of a man who did not talk much and had no practice at making it pretty. Clara looked up, and the words died in her throat. He was tall, broad across the shoulders in a work-worn coat, dark hair that needed cutting, eyes the color of creek water in winter, that pale gray blue that looks almost silver when the light catches it right. But it was the scar that held her attention. A thick, jagged line running from his left ear down across his jaw to the corner of his mouth, pulling the skin into a permanent slight twist that made it impossible to read his expression from the left side. It was not a scar from any accident. Clara had seen enough of the world to recognize the work of a blade. She stared at it, not with revulsion, not with fear. She stared at it the way you stare at something you recognize. Because Clara had scars too. Hers just did not show on the outside. "You are the woman from the stagecoach," he said. It was not a question. Yes. He set the crate down on the boardwalk and bent to pick up her spilled belongings. His hands were large and careful as he folded the cotton dress and placed it back in the carpet bag along with the broken watch. He did not comment on either. He did not turn the watch over to examine it or ask why she carried a timepiece that no longer worked. He simply placed it back as if he understood that some broken things are kept for reasons that do not require explanation. He handed the bag back to her. "Where are you staying?" he asked. Clara hesitated. Pride and desperation fought a brief savage war inside her chest, and desperation won. "I am working on that," she said. "Boarding house turned you away. There was no point in lying." "I do not have the money. Hotel, same problem." He studied her for a moment. Not the way the boarding house woman had studied her, measuring and dismissing. He looked at her the way you look at something broken that you are trying to figure out how to fix. His eyes moved from her thin coat to her carpet bag to the church steps, where she had been sitting, and she watched him put the pieces together without needing to be told. "Nobody sleeps outside in this weather," he said. "I am aware," Clara said, and she was surprised to hear something close to humor in her own voice, dry and thin, but still there, still alive. "I have got a cabin," he said, "about 8 miles out up toward the mountain. Extra blankets. Warm fire. You can stay until the stagecoach is fixed." He said it the way a man might say the sky is blue or water is wet, a simple fact requiring no elaboration. "Name is Elijah Crane. Eli." Clara stood there on the boardwalk of Willow Creek with the cold biting through her coat and the dark coming on fast, and 17 cents to her name and nowhere on this earth to go. Every instinct drilled into her since childhood screamed that this was dangerous. A woman did not go off alone with a strange man into empty wilderness, especially a young woman who had never been touched by any man and had spent the last 2 years of her life protecting that fact with the ferocity of someone defending the only valuable thing she owned. That was how women disappeared. But she watched him walk to his wagon and load the crate among the other supplies, careful to keep the flour sacks away from the egg crate. She watched him speak softly to his horses, 2 sturdy bays with winter coats just coming in, rubbing one behind the ears until it nickered and pushed its nose against his chest. She watched his hands, The way they moved with patient precision. Never rough, never careless. A man who was gentle with his horses she thought was unlikely to be cruel to a stranger. She picked up her carpet bag and followed him to the wagon. And as she climbed up onto the bench seat, she was aware with a clarity that cut like glass that she was placing more than her life in this stranger's hands. She was placing every part of herself, including the part she had guarded most fiercely, into the care of a mountain man she had known for less than 5 minutes. She did not do this because she trusted him. She did it because she had run out of reasons to be afraid of dying. As the wagon pulled away from town, Clara looked back at Willow Creek sinking into darkness. 17 cents in her pocket. Not a soul alive who knew she was here. If this man killed her tonight, no one would come looking. She turned forward, into the dark that swallowed the road whole, and she decided that if this was how she died, at least she had tried to live one more day. 200 miles to the east, in a small office above a feed store in a town whose name does not matter, a man named Nathaniel Hale sat across from a private detective and slid a photograph across the desk. Young woman, brown hair. The detective studied the image. Nathaniel leaned forward. She answered my brother's advertisement. Mail order bride. My brother died before she arrived, but she kept heading west. Tracker, the detective nodded. Trail leads toward Wyoming territory. That narrow, Nathaniel said. Make it narrower. The wagon climbed away from the flatlands and into the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Pine trees rose on either side, tall and dark and close together, and the air grew thinner and colder with each mile. The road narrowed from a proper track to a trail barely wide enough for the wagon. Eli drove with his eyes forward and his hands loose on the reins. He did not talk. The longest sentence he managed on the entire ride was, "Watch the rut there," when the wagon wheel caught the edge of a washed-out groove and jerked hard to the left. Clara grabbed the bench seat. Their shoulders touched briefly. Eli pulled away as if he had been burned. He was not being cold. He had simply forgotten how to hold up his end of a conversation. The last person he had talked to for longer than the time it took to buy supplies was Josie Wheeler. And that had been 3 weeks ago, and most of what Josie said did not require a response. They were a mile from the cabin when the wolf appeared. It stood in the middle of the trail, a big gray male, alone. No pack, just one animal with its head low and its eyes catching the lantern light in 2 bright points of yellow. The horses saw it first. The bay on the left threw its head up and tried to shy sideways. The other locked its legs and refused to move. Clara went rigid beside him. He could feel the tension radiating off her body like heat from a stove. Her hand gripped the edge of the bench so hard her knuckles turned white. Eli did not panic. He held the reins steady with his left hand and reached slowly for the rifle with his right. He did not raise it. He just rested his hand on the stock and waited. The wolf stared at him. He stared back. There was a time not so long ago when Elijah Crane would have pulled that trigger without thinking. When the thing inside him that Shiloh had left behind, the thing that answered every threat with violence immediate and overwhelming, would have put a bullet through that animal before his conscious mind even registered the decision. But he was not that man anymore. He had spent 5 years killing that man and burying him in the same ground where Ruth lay. The wolf held its position for 10 seconds, 20. Then it turned its head slow and deliberate and walked off the trail into the tall grass. It did not run. It vanished. One moment it was there, solid and real, and the next the grass and the trees had swallowed it whole as if it had never existed. Eli clucked to the horses, and they moved forward, shaking their heads and blowing hard through their nostrils. He did not say anything, but he knew Clara had noticed the calm, the control, the way his hand had not trembled. This was a man who understood danger. Her silence said she was calculating. The question was whether the danger pointed outward or inward. The cabin appeared as the last light bled out of the sky, a low structure of rough-hewn pine logs with a stone chimney and a wide porch running along the front. Behind it, a line of cottonwood trees and the sound of running water from the creek that came down off the mountain. A barn, a chicken coop, a corral where 2 horses watched their approach with lazy interest. And behind the cabin, barely visible in the failing light, 2 wooden crosses standing in the frozen grass. Eli hoped she could not see them in the dark. He was not ready to explain those. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the porch and climbed down and offered his hand to help Clara from the bench. She took it. Her fingers were ice cold, and he noticed she was shaking, though whether from the temperature or from something else he could not tell. Inside the cabin was dark and cold, smelling of old wood smoke and dust, and the particular scent of a place lived in by a solitary man who had stopped caring about comfort a long time ago. Eli lit the kerosene lamp, and warm light spread across a single large room. A stone fireplace, a rough table with two chairs, a dry sink with open shelves holding tin cups and plates, a bed against the far wall covered with a patchwork quilt. And that was everything. No decorations, no personal touches, no pictures or curtains or flowers or anything that suggested Joy had ever lived here. It was the loneliest room Clara had ever seen, and she had seen some lonely rooms. She stood in the middle of it and looked around, and Eli watched her look, bracing himself for the judgment, for the pity, for the careful, neutral expression that people wore when they did not want to say what they were thinking. But Clara Bennett looked at the cold, bare cabin where Elijah Crane had been slowly dying for 3 years, and she said one word: warm. Something in his chest cracked, a small sound like ice giving way on a creek in early spring. Not a break, just a shift, just enough to let something through that had been frozen solid for a very long time. He built a fire. He worked efficiently, coaxing kindling into flame, stacking larger logs until the fire crackled and heat began pushing back the cold. Then he pulled blankets from a chest near the bed and made up a pallet on the floor near the hearth, a rolled coat for a pillow, a wool blanket on top. Clara watched him work. Then she asked the question that would echo through every room of this story from beginning to end and back again. Where do I sleep? Eli pulled the blanket back and smoothed it flat. Right here, he said. I will take the porch. She started to protest. He cut her off, not unkindly. The fire will keep this room warm through the night. There is more wood stacked by the door if it gets low. Coffee in the pot on the stove if you want to heat it up. Help yourself to whatever you need. He was at the door before she found her voice. Mr. Crane, Eli, he said without turning. Eli, I do not know how to thank you. No need. He went outside, closed the door softly behind him, sat down on the porch with his back against the cabin wall, and wrapped a thin blanket around his shoulders, and stared out at the dark where two wooden crosses stood like sentinels in the frozen grass. The cold was immediate and savage. It cut through the blanket and his coat and settled into his bones with the efficient cruelty of a thing that had been doing this work for millennia. He did not care. He had endured worse. The winter he buried Ruth, he had slept on the frozen ground next to her grave for 3 nights straight before Josie Wheeler rode over and physically dragged him inside. He whispered into the dark, facing the two crosses he could barely see. I am not replacing you. I just could not let another one die because I did nothing. The wind answered with nothing. Ruth had been dead for 2 years and 5 months, and she had never answered him once in all that time. He kept talking to her anyway, because the alternative was admitting she could not hear, and he was not ready for that. From inside the cabin he heard crying, small and choked and muffled, the sound of someone who had forgotten how to cry out loud, who had been holding it in so long that when it finally came out, it came in little broken pieces instead of one clean release. Eli closed his eyes and endured it, because it was the most familiar sound he knew. He had made that exact same sound alone in this cabin for months after Ruth died. The sound of grief compressed into something small enough to survive. He sat on the porch in the freezing dark and listened to a stranger cry. And he did not go to her, and he did not look away. He just sat there, bearing witness to a pain he recognized as intimately as his own heartbeat. 3 days in Elijah Crane's cabin, and Clara still had not told him the real reason she could never go back to Pennsylvania. Not the controlling stepfather, not the locked rooms or the suffocating silence. But because at the bottom of a staircase in a house she had lived in for 4 years, there was a man she had pushed, and she did not know if he was alive or dead. The memory came in fragments. Walter's hand in her hair, the window she had been climbing through, his fingers yanking her backward, her hands against his chest, shoving, not thinking, just reacting with the desperate animal strength of a creature cornered. The sound his body made hitting the stairs, the way he rolled heavy and boneless all the way to the bottom. The blood, the stillness, the terrible silence that followed. She had not checked. She had climbed out the window and run into the night, and for 8 months she had carried the image of Walter Griggs lying at the bottom of those stairs with blood spreading across the wooden floor and she did not know if she was a woman who had escaped or a woman who had killed. But the days had fallen into a rhythm that surprised Clara with its ease. She woke at dawn to the smell of coffee because Eli was always up before her, moving quietly around the cabin in that careful way he had, and as if he were trying not to disturb the air itself. He would set her coffee on the table and step back, not hand it to her, set it down and move away, giving her space without being asked. She noticed. She noticed everything about the way this man moved through the world, the way he placed things down for her to pick up rather than putting them in her hands, the way he announced himself with a soft clearing of his throat before entering a room, the way he kept 3 feet of distance between them at all times, as if he had drawn an invisible boundary and would not cross it. For a woman who had spent years having her space invaded, this was the most extraordinary kindness anyone had ever shown her. After breakfast they worked. There was always work on a mountain ranch, even a small one. Clara fed the chickens while Eli tended the horses. She hauled water from the creek while he chopped wood. She swept the cabin floor while he mended a section of fence that the wind had pushed over in the night. The labor was physical and immediate, and Clara threw herself into it with a hunger that surprised her. Because the work kept her hands busy, and when her hands were busy, her mind did not drift back to the staircase in Pennsylvania. But the memories came anyway, swimming up through the surface like fish rising from dark water. She discovered something about Eli on the second day. The cabin had ingredients: flour and sugar and salt and dried beef and potatoes in the root cellar and eggs from the chickens. But Eli cooked the same thing every meal: beans, salt pork, coffee, as if variety were a pleasure he did not deserve, as if feeding himself anything more than the bare minimum required for survival would be an act of enjoyment, and enjoyment was something he had permanently revoked from himself. Clara recognized this. She recognized it because she had been doing the same thing for 8 months, eating only enough to keep moving, sleeping only enough to function, denying herself every small comfort as if comfort were a privilege reserved for people who had not done terrible things in the dark. On the third afternoon, while Eli was out checking the cattle in the north pasture, Clara opened the wooden chest near the bed. She was looking for extra blankets. The November nights were brutal, and even with the fire burning strong, the cold crept in through the log walls and settled on the floor where she slept. She found the baby shoes first. 2 pairs, tiny, unworn. One pair was knitted from soft yellow yarn, each stitch even and careful, made by hands that had taken their time. The other was cut from leather so supple and thin it could have been folded into Clara's palm, stitched with thread so fine it was almost invisible. They had never been put on a child's feet. They had been made with love and hope, and then placed in a dark chest because the child they were meant for never arrived. Clara held them in her hands, and her heart stopped. She understood instantly. She understood the way only someone who has lost something irreplaceable can understand another person's loss. These shoes told the whole story without a single word. Someone had been expecting a baby. Someone had prepared with careful hands and a heart full of dreams. Back carefully, exactly as she had found back carefully, exactly as she had found them. Then she saw the letter. It was folded beneath the shoes. A woman's handwriting, small and neat. The paper was old, the ink faded, but the words were clear. Clara unfolded it just enough to read the first line. "Dear Catherine, I am frightened of him." Her blood went cold. The cabin, which had begun to feel safe over 3 days, suddenly felt like a cage with the door swinging shut. She did not read more. She folded the letter back, placed it beneath the baby shoes, and closed the chest. Her hands were shaking. "I am frightened of him," written by a woman in this cabin, about the man whose roof Clara was sleeping under. Ruth, the dead wife, the woman buried behind the cabin in one of those 2 graves Clara had not yet gone to look at. Ruth had been frightened of Elijah Crane, frightened enough to write a letter about it, to someone named Catherine. Clara stood in the middle of the cabin and forced herself to breathe. She looked at the door, and the old instinct rose in her like water rising in a well. The instinct that said, run. The instinct that had gotten her out of Pennsylvania and onto a stagecoach heading west. The instinct that said when things got dangerous, the smart move was always to leave. But she had nowhere to go, and 17 cents would not take her anywhere. And besides, there was something in the careful way Eli moved through the world, the way he had taken the porch instead of the warm room, The way he set her coffee down instead of handing it to her. The way he handled the horses and the eggs and the rifle when the wolf appeared. Steady, controlled, deliberately gentle. As if gentleness were a skill he had worked hard to learn, practiced daily, like a man rehabilitating a broken limb. A man who was dangerous would not have slept on a freezing porch so a stranger could feel safe. Would he? She pushed the question down with all the others and went back to her bread dough. But the seed was planted, and it changed the way she held herself around him. Slightly more watchful, slightly less relaxed, an ear tuned to sounds she had not been listening for before. That evening, Clara made the stew. Dried beef and potatoes and onions, and the last of the carrots she found in the cellar simmered for hours until the meat fell apart and the broth was thick and rich. When Eli came in from the cold, stamping his boots on the porch and hanging his coat by the door, the cabin smelled like a home for the first time in what Clara guessed was a very long while. He sat at the table. She set the bowl in front of him. He picked up his spoon and took the first bite. And then he stopped. His eyes closed, not like a man savoring food, like a man absorbing pain, as though the taste of something cooked with care was a wound he had not expected. As though kindness, after years of self-imposed deprivation, hit harder than cruelty ever could. He ate slowly, deliberately, and when the bowl was empty, he sat there for a moment with his hands flat on the table, not looking at her. "That was real good," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "Thank you." 2 words, but the way he said them, as if they cost him something, as if gratitude were a muscle he had not used in years, told Clara that it had been a very long time since anyone had cooked for this man with anything resembling love. They talked that evening, still carefully, still keeping distance between the words. But the silences grew shorter and the sentences grew longer, and Clara found herself almost smiling once or twice at the dry way Eli described his more difficult cattle. Then she was at the dry sink washing dishes, and the knife slipped. It was nothing, a small cut on her index finger. The blade nicked the skin just below the nail, and a thin line of blood welled up and dropped into the basin of water. 1 drop. 2. Clara froze. Not from the pain, from the color. Red in water, spreading, thinning. The way blood looks when it swirls through clean liquid, becoming something almost beautiful before it becomes something horrible. She was back on the staircase. She was standing at the top, and Walter was at the bottom, and there was blood on the wooden floor, and he was not moving, and she did not know if she had killed him, and she could not breathe. She did not move. Could not. Her hand was under the water, and the blood was still coming, and she was not in Wyoming anymore. She was in Pennsylvania at the top of a staircase at midnight, and the world had taken everything from her, and she could not breathe. Eli appeared beside her. She had not heard him move. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not demand an explanation. He simply took a clean cloth from the counter, and he paused. His hand hovered near hers, and he looked at her face, reading it, asking permission with his eyes, the way a man does when he understands that touch can be violence for someone who has been touched wrong. She gave the smallest nod. He lifted her hand out of the water and wrapped the cut finger in the fabric. Then he held her hand in both of his. His grip was warm and steady. His scarred, calloused hands closed around her smaller ones and held them like something fragile and precious. He stood there saying nothing while Clara shook and could not stop shaking. Slowly, by degrees, the trembling eased. The staircase receded. The present reasserted itself. She was here, in Eli Crane's cabin in Wyoming. She was alive. She was safe. He let go of her hands, stepped back, gave her space. And Clara said something she had not planned to say, something she had not told anyone, not the boarding house landlady in St. Louis, not the stagecoach driver, not a single soul on this earth. "I hurt someone once. I do not know if they are alive or dead." 3 sentences, then silence. Eli stood there in his cabin that smelled of stew and wood smoke and looked at Clara Bennett with an expression she had not expected. Not pity, not shock, not the hollow sympathy she had braced herself for. Recognition, as though he were hearing his own story told back to him in someone else's voice. He did not ask what happened. She did not explain. But something shifted between them in that moment. Some wall that had been standing holding them apart developed a crack. Not a collapse, just a fissure. just enough to let the light through. And in the chest across the room, beneath two pairs of unworn baby shoes, a dead woman's letter waited like a lit fuse. The next morning, Clara went behind the cabin looking for the well and found two crosses instead. She stood there in the early frost, her breath making small white clouds in the air, and read the names carved into weathered wood. The tall cross said Ruth Crane, born 1842, died 1871. The light of my life. The small cross said Baby Crane, 1871. Never drew breath. Clara stood between the two graves and understood that the man who had given her shelter was living inside his own graveyard. She did not go inside to ask about it. She did not demand an explanation or an account or a history. Instead, she knelt down in the frozen grass and began pulling weeds from around the crosses. The earth was hard and cold, and the weeds came up reluctantly, clinging to the soil with stubborn roots. And Clara pulled them one by one, working slowly and carefully around the wooden markers. When Eli found her 30 minutes later, she was on her knees beside his dead wife's grave, her fingers raw and dirty, a small pile of uprooted weeds beside her. She did not look up when she heard his boots in the grass. She just kept working. He stood there for a long time. She could feel him watching her, the way you feel the sun on your back even when you cannot see it. Then he sat down. Not beside her, a few feet away, cross-legged in the frozen grass, his elbows on his knees, his eyes on the two crosses. He was quiet for so long that Clara finished the weeds around Ruth's grave and started on the babies. She died in childbirth, Eli said. His voice was flat, not emotionless. The opposite. So full of emotion that he had compressed it down to something dense and hard and controlled the way you compress gunpowder into a cartridge. Every word measured, every syllable held in check. We had been out here 2 years, built this cabin with our own hands, every log, every nail. She was strong, strongest person I ever knew. And when the baby started coming, she was not scared. She said women had been doing this since the beginning of time, and she was not going to be the one who could not manage it. He picked up a piece of dried grass and turned it over in his fingers. The labor went wrong. I do not know how. I am not a doctor. There was blood. Too much blood. The baby came out wrong, not breathing. I tried everything I knew, which was nothing. I held that baby in my arms for 2 hours before I could make myself believe it was real, that she was gone. They were both gone. He said it the way a soldier gives a battlefield report, clinical, stripped of everything but fact, because that was the only way he could say it without shattering. I dug the graves the next morning. Ground was frozen. Took me all day with a pickaxe. Josie Wheeler came over and tried to help, but I would not let her. Had to do it myself. Felt like if I did not dig those graves with my own hands, then maybe it was not real. Clara stopped pulling weeds. She sat back on her heels and looked at Eli Crane, this man made of scars and silence. And she saw the thing he had been hiding behind all that quiet. Not strength, grief. A grief so enormous it had eaten everything else and left only the shell. I know, she said. And then she told him. She told him about Pennsylvania, about the staircase and the blood and the midnight darkness and the man she might have killed. She told him about Walter's hands in her hair and the shove that was not a plan but a reflex. She told him about the 8 months of carrying this secret like a stone in her chest because there was nobody alive she trusted enough to give it to. They sat on cold grass beside two graves and shared the same hell in different versions. I think that is why I was not afraid when I followed you that night, Clara said. Not because I trusted you, because I had stopped being afraid of dying. Something moved behind Eli's eyes. Something buried deep, shifting loose for the first time in years, the way a stone shifts in a riverbed when the current finally runs strong enough to move it. He looked at Clara, and she saw the exact moment when his reason for caring about her changed. It was no longer guilt, no longer obligation. It was something else, something he did not yet have a name for, something that frightened him more than anything else in the world. And outside the cabin, the November wind picked up strength, carrying the first bitter promise of the deepest cold yet to come. The stagecoach was still broken. 10 days remained until the parts from Denver might arrive. And somewhere to the east, getting closer with every passing hour, a man named Nathaniel Hale was following a trail that led straight to this mountain and this cabin and this woman who had no idea he was coming. Would you have stayed, knowing about the letter, knowing about the graves, knowing that the man beside you carried a darkness you could not fully see? Or would you have run? Tell me in the comments. Because what happens next when Clara discovers the full truth about Eli's past and the real reason his wife wrote those words will test everything she thought she knew about danger and about trust and about what it really means to choose to stay. They rode into Willow Creek on the fourth morning to check on the stagecoach, and Clara felt the town watching before she saw the eyes. It was a particular feeling one she had learned in Pennsylvania, the sensation of being measured by people who had already decided what you were worth. The main street of Willow Creek was not crowded, but every face that turned toward Eli's wagon carried the same expression. Curiosity sharpened to a point. A scarred mountain man who had not brought anyone to town in 3 years was suddenly riding in with a young woman on the bench seat beside him, and the town was doing its arithmetic. Eli seemed not to notice. Or if he noticed, he had long since stopped caring what the people of Willow Creek thought of him. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the blacksmith shop and climbed down without looking at anyone. The blacksmith, a thick-armed man named Garrett with permanently soot-stained hands, delivered the news the way a man delivers a death sentence, without ceremony and without hope. Axle parts have to come from Denver, he said. 10 days minimum. Could be longer depending on the weather and the freight schedule. Clara heard the words and waited for the panic that should have followed. The desperation, the fear. She had 17 cents and no plan, and no cousin Martha waiting in Silver Creek, though she did not know that last part yet. 10 more days stranded in a town where she knew exactly wanted one person, and that person was a man. The whole town treated like something dangerous that had wandered down from the mountain. But the panic did not come. Instead, she felt something else entirely. Something confusing and unexpected and impossible to name. She looked at Eli. Eli looked at her. And they both knew that 10 more days was not a sentence. It was something else. Something neither of them was ready to say out loud. At the general store buying flour and coffee and a new spool of thread because Clara had noticed that half of Eli's shirts needed mending, she felt the eyes before she saw the woman. A prickling on the back of her neck. The sense of being watched by something patient and predatory. The kind of attention that does not announce itself but makes the air heavier. She turned and saw Delilah Blackwood for the first time. The mayor's wife stood near the dry goods counter in a dress that cost more than everything Clara owned combined. 53 years old. Gray hair arranged with the precision of someone who understood that appearance was a weapon. A face that might have been kind once but had been trained into something harder, the way leather is shaped by pressure and heat into whatever form serves the maker's purpose. Her eyes traveled from Clara to Eli and back again, and she smiled. Not a warm smile. The smile of a woman who had just identified something that did not belong in her carefully ordered world and was already calculating how to remove it. Clara felt danger. She did not understand it yet, but she felt it the way animals feel, a coming storm in the blood, and the bone in the place beneath conscious thought where survival lives. They did not speak. Delilah simply looked and smiled and turned away to resume her shopping, as if Clara were of no more consequence than a fly on the windowsill. On the ride home, Eli was quiet longer than usual. The wagon creaked and the horses plodded and the mountain trail wound upward through the pines, and neither of them spoke until they were halfway back to the cabin. Then Eli said something that changed the weight of the air between them. "Mrs. Blackwood noticed you." "I know," Clara said. "No, you do not understand." He pulled the reins tighter and the horses slowed to a walk. In Willow Creek, Delilah Blackwood does not just notice people. She chooses them. And when Delilah Blackwood chooses someone, that person does not get peace again. The words hung in the cold air between them, and Clara thought about the letter in the chest and the 2 graves behind the cabin, and the way the wolf had stood in the road and stared, and then vanished into the grass, and she wondered how many kinds of danger a person could face in a single lifetime, and whether there was a number after which you simply stopped counting. The next afternoon, Delilah Blackwood came to the cabin. She arrived in a polished buggy, driven by a hired man wearing a coat trimmed with fur that probably cost more than Eli's entire herd. She carried a basket of bread and preserves, the universal currency of women who wanted to appear neighborly while conducting reconnaissance. Clara was alone. Eli had ridden out to check the fence line on the south pasture. The sound of the buggy brought Clara to the porch with her hand instinctively close to the doorframe, close to the inside of the cabin, where Eli kept the rifle. Mrs. Blackwood, Clara said. Delilah climbed down from the buggy with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent decades making every movement look effortless. She held up the basket and smiled that same calculated smile. I wanted to welcome our newest neighbor, she said. Such a long ride up this mountain. You must be very devoted to Mr. Crane's company to endure it. The emphasis on devoted was subtle but unmistakable. Clara felt it land the way you feel a needle slide under your skin, sharp and thin, and designed to cause exactly the right amount of pain. That is very kind, Clara said. She did not take the basket. Delilah's eyes moved past Clara into the cabin, scanning, evaluating, taking inventory of every object visible through the open door, the way a general surveys a battlefield before committing troops. Such a pretty young thing, Delilah said. Her voice was honey poured over glass. Living all the way up here alone with Mr. Crane. People in town talk, you know. They cannot help themselves. A young woman unmarried and a man with well. She gestured vaguely toward her own face. His history. I'm not sure what you mean by his history, Clara said. Oh, you know. Delilah set the basket on the porch railing since Clara had not taken it. The graves behind the house, 2 of them. People notice these things. A man whose wife died under his roof and whose baby never drew breath. And now another young woman living under that same roof. She paused and let the silence do its work. You are not frightened. Clara looked at Delilah Blackwood with the steady, unblinking focus of someone who had spent years reading the intentions behind polite words, who had learned in a house in Pennsylvania that the most dangerous sentences were the ones that sounded kindest. I am frightened of many things, Mrs. Blackwood, Clara said. Mr. Crane is not on the list. Something flickered behind Delilah's eyes. Not anger, surprise. The surprise of a woman accustomed to intimidating people with a smile who had just encountered someone the smile did not work on. How brave of you, Delilah said, or how foolish. In this country, the two often look the same. She turned and climbed back into the buggy with the same practiced grace. The hired man clicked the horse forward, and Delilah Blackwood rode away down the mountain trail without looking back, leaving the basket of bread on the porch railing like a calling card. Clara did not touch it. She stood on the porch and watched the buggy disappear around the bend in the trail, and she felt the hairs on her arms standing up, and she understood with complete clarity that the conversation she had just had was not a welcome. It was a declaration of war. When Eli returned that evening and saw the basket, he did not need to ask who had left it. She came here, he said. It was not a question. She wanted to introduce herself, Clara said. Eli picked up the basket and set it inside the cabin without opening it. His face was the face of a man who had just heard hoofbeats approaching in the dark and was calculating how much time remained before they arrived. What did she say? She asked if I was frightened of you. Eli looked at her. What did you tell her that you are not on my list? Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. The faintest echo of what a smile might look like on a man who had forgotten how to make one. It did not last. His eyes hardened. She will come back, he said, or she will send someone. That is how she works. She finds what she wants to control, and she does not stop until she controls it or destroys it. Josie Wheeler arrived the next morning as if summoned by some sixth sense that told her when trouble had come to Eli Crane's doorstep. She rode in on a buckskin mare with a shotgun across her saddle and a pot of stew hanging from the saddle horn. Josie Wheeler was 55 years old, built like a fence post wrapped in rawhide with dark skin weathered by decades of prairie sun and mountain wind. She had been born into slavery in Georgia, freed by the war, and had come west with her husband Samuel Wheeler in 1866. They had built a ranch together from nothing in the foothills, 20 miles south of Eli's land. Samuel died of fever in 1870, and Josie had kept the ranch going alone ever since. She was the one who had stitched Eli's face when he first arrived in Wyoming territory. The scar was not from a horse accident, which was what people in town assumed. It was a bayonet wound from the Battle of Shiloh, April 1862, that had never healed properly because the field surgeon who was supposed to close it had been killed by artillery fire before he finished the stitching. Josie had recognized a war wound when she saw one, and she had sewn him up without asking questions, because out here, questions were a luxury that could get people killed. She looked at Clara with sharp, appraising eyes and said, So this is the girl the whole town is buzzing about. I thought you would be taller the way they tell it. Clara liked her immediately. While Eli rode out to check the rest of his herd, Josie took Clara somewhere. They saddled two horses and rode east for about a mile until they came to a place where the mountain flattened out into a small meadow near the creek. Weeds grew through a cracked stone foundation. A rusted stovepipe lay on its side in the grass. A chimney stood alone, connected to nothing like a finger pointing at the sky. Family named Sullivan ran a homestead here, Josie said. She sat her horse and looked at the ruins with an expression that was neither sad nor angry, but something older than both. Came here from County Cork in Ireland. Husband, wife, two children. The little one was born right there where that stovepipe is. She paused and let the wind fill the silence. Delilah Blackwood decided they lowered the tone of the area. 6 months later, their barn burned. Then their well was poisoned. Then the sheriff told them it might be healthier to move along. They left for California with nothing but the clothes on their backs and two little children who did not understand why they had to leave their home. Josie looked at Clara. Her eyes were steady and hard and full of a kind of anger that has gone past hot and cooled into something permanent. There was a freedman before them, bought land near town, wanted to farm. Delilah told her husband, the mayor, that property values would suffer. The man's cattle were poisoned, his fences cut, his well filled with dead animals. He left inside a month. And a widow from Ireland who sold whiskey, another family who ran a laundry on Main Street, all gone, all driven out, driven. All by the quiet machinery of Delilah Blackwood. I survive because I live far enough away that she does not bother with me, Josie said. But you are right there in her sight line, living with a man she considers strange and dangerous, defying every rule she has built her world around. You are not the first person she has targeted. You are just the latest. Clara looked at the ruined foundation and the rusted stovepipe and the chimney standing alone. And she thought about the people who had built something here and lost it. Not to fire or flood or the simple cruelty of the land, but to the cruelty of a woman who could not tolerate anything that challenged her idea of how the world should be. I am not going to run, Clara said. She was surprised by the steel in her own voice. I have been running for 8 months and I am done. Good, Josie said. Then we need to make sure you can protect yourself. That evening, Eli taught Clara to shoot. He set up tin cans on the fence rail behind the barn and showed her how to hold the rifle, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight along the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it. He stood behind her with his hands on her arms, adjusting her stance, and they were closer than they had ever been. Clara could feel the heat of his body through his coat. She could smell leather and grass and wood smoke and the particular scent of a man who worked with his hands in cold weather. And neither of them said a word about any of it. But Clara was aware with a clarity that felt like standing in bright sunlight that this was the first time a man had touched her and she had not flinched. The first time hands on her body felt like instruction rather than invasion. The first time physical closeness produced not fear, but something else, something warm and unfamiliar that lived in her chest and spread outward like heat from a fire. She missed the first shot by 2 feet, the second by 6 inches. The third shot hit the can dead center and sent it spinning off the rail with a sharp metallic ring that echoed off the mountain behind them. Good, Eli said, one word. But the way he said it, like he was slightly less afraid for her than he had been a moment before, told Clara everything she needed to know. He was not teaching her to shoot for recreation. He was preparing her for the possibility that he might not be there when she needed protecting. 3 days later, Eli found 3 dead cattle in the north pasture. Their throats were cut clean and professional. Not wolves, not bears. A knife wielded by someone who knew exactly where to place the blade for maximum efficiency and minimum noise. 3 cows lying in the frozen grass with their blood turning the frost pink around them like halos made of violence. Eli stood over them for a long time, reading the ground the way a man reads a letter. Boot prints, hoof marks, the angle of the cuts, the depth, the precision. This was not random cruelty. This was a message. Clara watched from the fence line and saw his face go still and hard the way a lake freezes over surface smooth and cold, while everything underneath goes dark. He did not rage, did not shout, did not curse or threaten or swing his fist at the air. He just stood there and calculated. $90, he said when he came back to the cabin. That is what those 3 head were worth. A third of what I would make this year. Someone wants me off this land or wants me poor enough that I have to sell. Who, Clara asked. Could be anyone. Could be the Blackwoods looking to expand their holdings. Could be someone who does not like me. He paused. Could be someone who does not like you being here. The words landed in Clara's chest like stones dropped into still water. Clara rode into town alone the next morning. She found Delilah Blackwood at the general store examining bolts of fabric with the unhurried attention of a woman who owned enough time to waste it. Mrs. Blackwood, Clara said, 3 of our cattle were killed last night. Throats cut. Professional work. Do you know anything about it? Delilah turned slowly, holding a length of blue cotton against her wrist, as if checking the color against her skin. Her expression was perfect sympathy, perfect concern, perfect performance. Oh, how terrible, she said. The wilderness can be so dangerous, especially for people who are not accustomed to it, especially for people who perhaps do not belong in it. Clara held her gaze. I belong wherever I choose to stand, Mrs. Blackwood. Delilah's eyes narrowed. Just a fraction, the width of a knife blade. The first honest expression Clara had seen on her face. What a spirited young woman you are, she said. I do hope that spirit serves you well in the days ahead. She turned back to her fabric. Conversation over. Clara walked out of the store with her pulse hammering and her hands steady and the absolute certainty that she had just made an enemy who would not stop until one of them was destroyed. That night, something broke inside Eli Crane. He did not let Clara see it happen. He waited until she was asleep in the cabin, until her breathing had gone slow and deep and steady, the way it did when she finally let go of the day's tension and allowed herself to rest. Then he went to the barn. The whiskey bottle had been sitting on a shelf behind the horse tack for 2 years, gathering dust. Untouched since the night Josie Wheeler had found him, passed out in the snow behind the cabin, half dead from cold and liquor, and had slapped him across the face hard enough to draw blood and said, "You can die if you want to, but you are going to do it sober so you know exactly what you are throwing away." He had not touched it since. 2 years. 700 and some days of choosing every morning to leave that bottle where it sat. 700 mornings of proving to the ghost of Ruth Crane that her husband could be better than the man she had been afraid of. But now 3 cows lay dead in his pasture, and someone was trying to destroy him, and he could feel the old thing stirring inside his chest. The thing that Shiloh had planted in him 12 years ago and 3 years of solitary grief had fed. The rage, the need to break something, the violence that lived in his bones like a dormant fever waiting for the moment when his defenses dropped low enough to let it rise. He uncorked the bottle, drank. The whiskey burned going down and hit his stomach like a fist. And he drank again. And then he stood up and put his fist through the barn wall. The pain was immediate and clarifying. The skin over his knuckles split open, and blood ran down his fingers, and he stared at his hand in the lantern light and thought, there you are. There is the man Ruth was afraid of. There is the man who came home from the war with something broken inside that he could not fix no matter how many years he spent trying. The barn door creaked open. Clara stood there in her coat hair loose around her shoulders, eyes wide with something that was not quite fear, but lived in the same house. She did not run, but she stayed in the doorway. She did not come closer. Are you going to tell me what that letter meant? She said. Eli felt the blood drain from his face. You read it. Only the first line. I am frightened of him. That was all I needed. Silence. The wind pushed against the barn walls. The horses shifted in their stalls. Blood dripped from Eli's knuckles onto the straw. Then he sat down, right there in the straw, back against the wall, and he told her the truth. Shiloh. He said the word and it sat in the air between them like a stone dropped from a great height. April 1862. 2 days of fighting so close you could smell the other man's breath. The bayonet that had opened his face from ear to jaw in a single motion, fast as a snake, and the sound it made going through skin and muscle, a sound he could still hear 12 years later if the night was quiet enough. The field hospital where they sewed him up without anesthetic because there was none left and they needed the table for the next man and the next man and the next. The months of recovery, The nightmares that came after, not gradually, but all at once, like a dam breaking. And what the nightmares did to him. I came home from the war and I was a different man, he said. Not right away. It happened slow, like a fever building. The dreams came first, then the anger, then the need to break things. I smashed chairs, punched walls, threw a table through a window. Ruth would find me in the middle of the night, standing in the yard, screaming at nothing, screaming at things only I could see. He looked at his bleeding hand. The blood was dark in the lantern light, almost black, running down his wrist and pooling in the creases of his palm. She was right to be afraid. I never touched her. Not once, I swear that on everything I have left. But she lived with a man she could not predict. And that is its own kind of violence. She never knew if the man who sat across from her at breakfast was going to be the man she married or the man who came home from Shiloh. And that uncertainty, that constant waiting for the boot to drop, that ate her alive. He looked up at Clara standing in the doorway with the cold wind at her back. She wrote that letter to her sister Catherine. Never sent it. I found it after she died. Read it once. Should have burned it. Could not make myself do it. Felt like if I burned it, I was pretending it never happened. And it happened. Clara stood in the doorway processing. Every instinct she had, the instinct that had carried her out of Pennsylvania and across 1,200 miles of desperate travel, screamed at her to leave. This man was dangerous once. His dead wife said so in her own handwriting. This was the moment to run. But Clara looked at his bleeding hand, saw the knuckles split from hitting a wall instead of a person, saw the whiskey bottle on its side in the straw, most of the liquid still inside because he had stopped himself before it was empty, saw the truth in his eyes offered freely and completely when a lie would have been so much easier and so much safer. I spent 5 years becoming someone she deserved, Eli said. I quit drinking. I learned to breathe through the nightmares. I taught myself to be still when the rage came instead of letting it loose. I became the man I should have been from the start. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked on the last word. Just barely. Just enough. But by the time I made it, she was in the ground. Clara felt something shift inside her chest. Something that had been locked tight for 8 months, sealed away behind walls she had built with fear and guilt, in the absolute conviction that trusting another person was the most dangerous thing a woman could do. She felt those walls develop a crack. Not wide, not yet, but enough. I am not going to live with a man who destroys himself, she said quietly. Her voice was steady even though her hands were shaking. If you want me here, you choose to live, not just exist. Choose it. Eli looked up at her, and for the first time since she had arrived at his cabin, Clara saw him afraid. Not of enemies or wolves or losing cattle. Afraid of being seen completely all the way down to the ugly parts and still being chosen. I will choose it, he said. I will try. Clara nodded once. Then she went back to the cabin and lay awake until she heard him come in from the barn. At some point in those dark hours, she got up, found the whiskey bottle, where he had left it, walked down to the creek that ran behind the cabin, and poured it out. The liquor disappeared into the cold black water without a sound. She did not tell him she had done it. He did not ask. But the next morning when he went to the barn and saw the bottle gone, he looked at her across the breakfast table, and something passed between them that did not require words. An agreement, a contract, written in silence and sealed with coffee, drunk across a rough-hewn table while the mountain wind blew outside and the fire crackled in the hearth. That night, the temperature dropped below zero. The wind came howling down from the high peaks. It screamed around the cabin walls like something alive trying to get inside. Clara lay awake listening to Eli turning on the hard porch boards in the freezing dark. He was out there, every night, freezing for her, so she could feel safe. She got up and opened the door. He was sitting with his back against the wall blanket around his shoulders, face red with cold, his breath coming in white clouds that the wind tore apart as soon as they formed. Come inside, she said. It is too cold. He looked up at her, and in the firelight spilling through the doorway, the scar on his face looked like a map of a country she was beginning to want to stay in. He came inside. He laid his blankets on the floor near the door, 6 feet from where Clara lay by the fire. Not because of feelings, because of 3 dead cattle and a threat neither of them could name. Because Eli needed to be between Clara and whatever might come through that door in the night. And in the morning when Clara woke, she smelled coffee. because Eli was already up moving quietly around the cabin in that careful way he had. He had made it before she woke, not because she asked him to, but because he wanted to see that moment when she opened her eyes and smelled it and smiled before she was fully awake, before the weight of the day settled onto her shoulders. That small, unguarded smile was becoming the thing Elijah Crane looked forward to most in the world. And he knew that was dangerous, because the last time he had loved someone, he had ended up digging graves. But Clara had told him to choose to live. And choosing meant accepting that some things were worth the risk of losing. The rider appeared on the trail at 6 in the morning, coming in hard from the east. On a mountain trail, nobody came calling at 6 in the morning with good news. Eli was standing on the porch with a cup of coffee watching the light come up through the pines when he spotted him. A figure on horseback moving fast following the switchback trail with the confidence of someone riding a good horse who expected the world to accommodate him. Clara was still asleep inside. He let her sleep. Whatever this was, she would know soon enough. The man dismounted in the yard. He was 36 years old, tall and well-built, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that might have been handsome if it had not been arranged into an expression of barely controlled fury, mixed with something that looked almost like grief. He tied his horse to the porch rail and looking past Eli toward the cabin with eyes that held equal parts anger and desperation. Clara appeared in the doorway behind Eli, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She saw the visitor, and she made a sound that was half gasp and half something older and more complicated than surprise. "Nathaniel," she said. Nathaniel Hale looked at Clara Bennett standing in the doorway of a mountain man's cabin, wearing a shawl over yesterday's dress, with her hair uncombed and the smell of coffee and wood smoke clinging to her, and his face went through a series of emotions so fast they blurred together. Relief, anger, possessiveness, pain. "Clara, thank God. I have been searching for you for weeks." Clara stepped out from behind Eli, and Eli noticed that she positioned herself beside him, not behind, standing her own ground. "What are you doing here, Nathaniel?" Nathaniel looked from Clara to Eli and back again. His eyes lingered on the cabin, on the 2 coffee cups, on the proximity of these 2 people standing on the porch together in the early morning light. "Your landlady in St. Louis said you had headed west," he said. "The trail went cold after that. I hired a detective, tracked you to the stagecoach company, then to Willow Creek, then here." He said the word "here" the way a man says something foul he has stepped in. "What I found is my brother's intended wife living alone with a strange man in a cabin on a mountain in the middle of nowhere. What exactly am I supposed to think about that?" "You are not supposed to think anything," Clara said. Her voice was careful and controlled, the voice of someone choosing each word with precision. "Mr. Crane offered me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. That is all." Nathaniel ignored this. He turned to Eli. "Can we talk inside?" "No," Eli said. "We can talk right here." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but then he did something Eli had not expected. He took a breath, and his expression changed. The anger drained away like water through a crack, replaced by something that looked remarkably like genuine pain. "Clara," he said, and his voice was different now, softer, cracked at the edges like old leather. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me." Clara waited. "Daniel took that mining job because I recommended it. I told him the money was good. I told him it was safe. I told him he would be a fool to pass it up." Nathaniel's eyes were bright with moisture. "He died in that mine because of me, because I pushed him into it. And I have lived with that every single day since." He looked at his hands, turned them over as if expecting to find blood on them. "I came out here because I owe him. I owe you. You were going to be his wife, his family. And I promised myself that whatever happened, I would make sure you were taken care of. That is all I want, just to make sure you are safe." Clara stood still. Eli could see the war on her face. The part of her that wanted to believe this man was sincere, fighting against the part that had learned through years of hard experience that sincerity was the easiest thing in the world to fake. Then Nathaniel said the thing that changed everything. "Clara, there is something else. About your cousin Martha in Silver Creek." He paused. "She passed. Consumption. About 18 months ago. There is nobody there. There is nothing waiting for you in Silver Creek." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Eli saw her sway, saw the color leave her face, saw saw the moment when the last shred of her plan, the thing she had been holding on to across 1,200 miles of desperate travel, the 3-year-old letter from a cousin who promised there would always be a place for family, evaporated like mist in morning sun. Martha was dead. Silver Creek was a dead end. There was nowhere left to go. Clara turned without a word and walked off the porch into the yard, heading out toward the open meadow beyond the corral. Not running, walking, but walking fast like someone trying to outpace something that could not be outpaced. Eli started to follow. Nathaniel moved to block him. Let her go. She needs time. She does not need time, Eli said. She needs to not be alone. He stepped around Nathaniel and followed Clara into the grass. He caught up to her about 50 yards from the cabin and fell into step beside her. He did not speak, did not touch her. Just walked beside her while the wind bent the mountain grass and the sky stretched enormous and empty above the peaks. They walked for a while. Then Clara stopped. I have nowhere to go, she said. Her voice was small and flat and stripped of everything. Eli stood beside her in the wind and said the truest thing he had ever said. You have here. 2 words. But they landed in the silence between them with the weight of something permanent, something that could not be unsaid and did not want to be. Back at the cabin, Nathaniel watched through the window. The woman he had tracked across half the country standing in the mountain grass with a scarred stranger, and the way she turned toward him instead of away. Nathaniel saw the moment he began losing, and it was not Clara he was losing to. It was Eli Crane, the man who had done nothing more extraordinary than stand beside her in the wind and say 2 words. Nathaniel left that afternoon, polite, controlled, the mask of grief and sincerity back in place. But as he mounted his horse, he leaned down and spoke to Eli in a voice too low for Clara to hear. She is my family, Crane. Blood. You are just a stranger who gave her a floor to sleep on. Do not confuse kindness with a claim. Eli said nothing, but his jaw was tight as iron, and his eyes tracked Nathaniel Hale down the mountain trail until horse and rider disappeared around the bend and the forest swallowed them whole. And on the road back to Willow Creek, Nathaniel Hale stopped his horse at the crest of the last rise. He sat there for a long moment, looking back toward the mountain where the cabin sat hidden among the pines. Then he turned his horse toward town, toward the largest house on Main Street, the mayor's house, Delilah Blackwood's house. He had a new plan, and it required an ally who knew how to make people disappear from this valley without getting her own hands dirty. That evening after supper, Clara and Eli sat on the porch. She mended one of his shirts, pulling thread through the frayed cuff with steady fingers. He sharpened his knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filled the space between them. The sun set. The sky turned from blue to gold, to deep amber, to purple. The wind settled to a whisper. Somewhere in the grass a cricket started up, and then another, until the whole mountain meadow hummed with small, persistent life. For a long time, neither of them spoke. There was no need. The silence was not empty. It was full. Full of the scrape of stone and the pull of thread and the settling of 2 people into each other's presence like water finding its level. This was the scene that said everything the story needed to say about love without once using the word. 2 people side by side doing small, quiet things in fading light. Not because they had to, because there was nowhere else they wanted to be. The fire started at 3 in the morning, and by the time Clara smelled smoke, the barn was a pillar of flame. She woke to the smell before the sound. Smoke thick and acrid, seeping through the cabin walls. Then the crackling. Not the gentle pop of their hearth fire, but a deeper, hungrier sound like something enormous eating its way through solid wood. Eli was already on his feet. He was out the door before Clara could form a word, and then she was at the window, and what she saw turned her blood to ice. The barn was fully engulfed. Flames climbed the walls and poured from the loft opening and lit the night sky orange. She could hear the horses screaming inside. Clara ran outside. Eli was at the barn doors wrestling with the latch. The heat was enormous, pushing at her like a solid wall, even from 30 feet away. She could see the sweat on his face already turning to steam. He got the doors open and plunged inside. Clara heard the horses scream again and then saw them burst out into the night. Eyes rolling white with terror, manes singed hooves throwing up clouds of frozen earth as they bolted for the corral. Then Eli came out, stumbling. His hands were black and blistered. He had grabbed the burning door with his bare hands to wrench it from its hinges when the latch failed. Behind him, the barn collapsed inward with a sound like the world ending. Sparks exploded upward in a column that lit the mountain for half a mile. Clara ran to him. He was bent over, coughing, his hands held out in front of him like they belonged to someone else. The skin from his wrists to his fingertips was raw and weeping. They stood in the yard and watched the barn burn to nothing. Everything inside was gone. Winter feed stores, tools, tack, saddles, a year's worth of supplies laid in against the cold. All of it turning to ash and smoke and floating upward into the dark Wyoming sky. The smell of kerosene was unmistakable. This was not an accident. This was arson. Someone had soaked the barn walls in fuel and set them alight while Clara and Eli slept not 40 yards away. Clara got him inside the cabin and sat him at the table. She heated water and tore a clean shirt into strips and began cleaning his burns. The skin was angry red and already blistering, the worst of it on his palms where he had gripped the burning wood. He sat rigid, jaw clenched. While she worked, "You are not allowed to die," she said. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "Was not planning on it. Promise me." He looked at her. His eyes were dark with pain and fury and something else she had not seen before, something like tenderness forced through a filter of agony. "I promise." She wrapped his hands in the torn cloth layer by careful layer, and when she tied the last knot, her fingers lingered on his wrist for a moment longer than necessary, and they both felt it, and neither of them pulled away. Sunday morning, Clara walked into the church during services. The entire town was there, filling the pews, heads bowed in prayer or pretending to be. Clara walked up the center aisle with dirt on her face and smoke on her clothes and the cold fury of a woman who had been pushed too far, too many times. The congregation stared. Reverend Hayes stopped mid-sentence. Clara stood at the front of the church and faced them all. She found Delilah Blackwood in the second row, dressed in black silk with a pearl brooch at her throat, looking at Clara with an expression of cultivated disbelief. "Someone burned our barn last night," Clara said. Her voice carried clear and calm to every corner of the small building. "I have no proof who did it, but I want every person in this church to know something. If my husband or I come to harm, the name Nathaniel Hale and anyone who aided him will be the first the law hears." She called Eli my husband. They were not married. No one corrected her. The word hung in the air of that church like a challenge and a claim and a line drawn in sand that dared anyone to cross it. The town was splitting. Clara could feel it happening in real time, like watching a crack run through ice. Some people shifting toward her side, not out of love or friendship, but out of something older and more practical, the recognition that what was happening to Clara and Eli could happen to any of them. Others stayed frozen in their seats, eyes forward, unwilling to meet Clara's gaze. These were the ones who feared Delilah Blackwood more than they feared their own consciences. Clara walked out without waiting for a response. That afternoon, Eli came to her while she was feeding the chickens and said the thing she had been waiting for and dreading at the same time. "We should get married." Clara's hands stilled on the grain bucket. "If we are legally married," he said, his voice practical and flat, "you are protected by territorial law. My land becomes your land, my property your property. If something happens to me, you keep everything. Nathaniel Hale cannot touch you." Clara set the bucket down. She turned to face him. She looked at his bandaged hands and his smoke-stained face and the scar that ran like a river across his jaw. "That is not a reason to get married," she said. "It is a good reason. The real reason, Eli." "No." She looked at him the way you look at someone when you are about to ask for the hardest thing they have to give. "I am a woman who has never been touched, never been kissed, never been held by a man who wanted me and not just what I could give him. When I marry, it will not be for property law. It will be because the man standing in front of me loves me and is brave enough to say it out loud." The words came out of her steady and clear and unshakable. The words of a woman who had been running for 8 months and had finally found the ground she was willing to stand on. "I married no one in Pennsylvania because no one there deserved me," she said. "If this is not love, I would rather face Nathaniel alone." Eli blinked. Then he was quiet for a long time. The wind blew, the chickens clucked and pecked. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals in slow, patient spirals. Clara had forced him into a corner. She was asking for the one thing that was harder for Elijah Crane than fighting or working or enduring pain. She was asking him to be vulnerable. She was asking him to take the most dangerous thing a man can do, which is to open his chest and show another person what lives inside, knowing that what lives inside is not pretty and might make her run. The silence stretched. Clara began to wonder if she had pushed too far. Then Eli spoke, and his voice was rough and halting, like a man trying to speak a language he had not used in years. It is not about the law. It is about the fact that you are the first reason I have had to wake up in the morning in 3 years. And I am terrified that if I say that out loud, I will lose you the way I lost her. Clara felt her eyes burn. Say it anyway, she said. Another silence, longer than the last. The wind blew and the hawks circled, and somewhere on the mountain a jay called out and was answered by another. I love you, Clara, and it scares me half to death. Good, Clara said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Now ask me again. He looked at her with those creek water eyes standing in the yard of a half-burned homestead with bandaged hands and nothing to offer but scarred land and a scarred heart. Will you marry me not for the law? For real, yet, Clara said, because I choose you, Eli Crane. I choose you. They married on Sunday morning in a half-empty church, Reverend Hayes presiding wearing a clean collar and an expression of genuine warmth. Josie Wheeler standing to one side as witness, dressed in her best coat, with her shotgun leaning against the pew, because Josie Wheeler did not go anywhere without her shotgun. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson from the general store standing on the other side looking pleased and slightly nervous. When Reverend Hayes asked, "Do you take this woman?" Eli said yes before the question was finished. Clara laughed, a real laugh, the first one in nearly a year. The sound surprised both of them. It rang through the half-empty church like a bell, and Eli looked at her with an expression of wonder, as if he had forgotten that laughter was something that existed in the world. They kissed at the altar, and Clara felt something shift inside her. Something that had been dislocated for a long time finally clicking back into place with a sound only she could hear. They walked out of the church into the afternoon sunlight. They made it 3 steps. Sheriff Dugan was waiting on the church steps with a warrant in his hand and an expression that said he would rather be anywhere else on earth. Elijah Crane, he said, I have a warrant here for your arrest. Cattle rustling, 6 head of Circle H branded cattle found on your property. Behind Dugan, Clara saw the faces. Nathaniel Hale standing with a group of men, Mayor Blackwood, several ranchers who looked uncomfortable but resolute, and a young man Clara did not recognize. Thin and weathered, who would not meet anyone's eyes, Tom Rollins, 28 years old. A drifter paid $50 to swear he saw something he never saw. Eli did not resist. He looked at Clara and said 5 words that were not a request, but a command born from love. Do not cry in front of them. Do not let them see you scared. Clara swallowed her tears. She nodded. She watched them put handcuffs on her husband's wrists still bandaged from the burns. Watched them lead him to a horse. Should have come with me. When you had the should have come with me, when you had the chance, he said. His face was a mask of satisfaction, poorly disguised as concern. Clara watched him go, and she felt something harden inside her, something cold and sharp and clear as glass. Not anger. Anger was hot and wild and burned itself out. This was something else. This was the thing that happens to a woman who has been pushed past every limit she thought she had and discovers on the other side of all that pushing that she is not broken. She is forged. She stood on the church steps in her wedding dress and watched her husband disappear down the mountain road. She had come to this town with 17 cents and not a soul alive who knew her name. Now she stood alone, newly married her husband behind bars, and the only weapon she possessed was the one thing she had always had. The will to keep standing when everything said she should fall. And this time it had to be enough. Because in 3 days there would be a trial. And if Clara could not find a way to expose the conspiracy that put those cattle on Eli's land, the man she had just promised her life to would hang from a rope for a crime he did not commit. 3 days. That was her ticking clock. That was her deadline. And Clara Bennett Crane, the virgin bride, who had arrived in Willow Creek with nothing and no one, was about to show this town exactly what happened when you cornered a woman who had nothing left to lose. But first she needed to find the cracks in the wall her enemies had built. And she already knew where to start looking. With the enemy's own daughter. That is where part 3 begins. Clara did not sleep the night they took Eli. She sat at the table in the cabin that smelled of wood smoke and bread and the fading ghost of kerosene from the barn that was now nothing but a black scar on the mountainside. She sat with her hands flat on the rough-hewn surface and her eyes fixed on the door, and she made a plan. Not a plan born from hope. Hope was a luxury she could not afford. This was a plan born from the same thing that had gotten her out of a house in Pennsylvania and across 1,200 miles of hostile country with 17 cents in her pocket. Pure, relentless refusal to be destroyed. She had 3 days before the trial, 3 days to dismantle a conspiracy built by a man driven by guilt and a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of ruining people who did not belong in her carefully ordered world. She saddled the horse Josie had left for her and rode the 8 miles into Willow Creek before the sun was fully up. Day 1, she went to Reverend Samuel Hayes. The old pastor sat in his study behind the church with a pot of coffee and a Bible, in the quiet, steady presence of a man who had seen the worst of human nature and decided to believe in the best anyway. His study was small and spare, a desk covered in papers, shelves of books with cracked spines, a single window that looked out on the cemetery where the town buried its dead. "I know what they did," Clara said. She sat across from him with her back straight and her hands still and her voice controlled. "They planted those cattle. Nathaniel in the Blackwoods. They framed him." Reverend Hayes nodded slowly. His eyes were kind, but they were not naive. They were the eyes of a man who had lived long enough to know that kindness without courage was just cowardice wearing a pleasant face. "I believe you," he said, "but believing and proving are two different things." Then he told her something she had not expected. Before he found God, before the collar and the Bible and the small white church at the end of Main Street, Samuel Hayes had been a gunfighter. He had ridden with a bad outfit in the Kansas Territory in the years before the war. He had killed men for reasons that stopped making sense decades ago. He had done things that lived in the back of his mind like animals in a cage, pacing and restless, and never fully tamed. "I know how men like Nathaniel operate," he said. His voice was calm, but underneath the calm was something harder, something forged in the same fires that had made him dangerous before God repurposed the steel for different work. "They build a story that looks solid from the outside. Witness testimony, physical evidence, the appearance of due process. But every structure has a weakness. Every conspiracy requires people, and people are unreliable." He leaned forward. "We do not need evidence," he said. "We need someone on their side to break." Clara left the church with a name forming in her mind and a strategy taking shape around it like ice forming on a branch, clear and sharp and hard enough to cut. Day 2, she found Margaret Blackwood. Maggie was coming out of the dressmaker's shop on Main Street when Clara stepped into her path. The mayor's daughter was 20 years old with her mother's features, but none of her mother's hardness. Not yet. There was still something unfinished about Maggie Blackwood, something soft and uncertain like clay that had not yet been fired. She could still become something different from what her mother was shaping her into. But the window for that was closing. Maggie's face went pale when she saw Clara. "Mrs. Crane," she said, and the name came out in a whisper. "I cannot talk to you. If my mother sees us." "Your mother is not here," Clara said, "and I am not going to waste your time with small talk." She stepped closer, close enough that Maggie could not look away, close enough that the words would land where Clara intended them to land. "You love Miguel Reyes," Clara said, "the wrangler at the Dawson Ranch. You have been seeing him in secret for 6 months. Maggie went white. Every drop of color drained from her face as if someone had pulled a plug. "How did you?" "Josie Wheeler sees everything," Clara said. "That is not the point. The point is this." She kept her voice low and even. Not threatening, not pleading, something between the two. The voice of a woman making an offer that was also, if you turned it the right way, in the light a lifeline. "Your mother has destroyed families in this town," Clara said. "She drove out the Sullivans. She drove out the freedmen who wanted to buy land. She drove out the widow and the laundry family, and God knows who else. And now she is trying to destroy my husband for the crime of not following her rules." Maggie's eyes were brimming with tears. Her chin trembled. She looked very young and very frightened, and Clara felt a stab of something that might have been guilt for what she was about to do to this girl's life. But guilt was another luxury she could not afford. Not today. "I do not need your courage," Clara said. "I need your selfishness. Help me, and I will help you get free of her." Maggie Blackwood looked at Clara Crane standing in the middle of Main Street with smoke still faintly clinging to her hair and determination in her eyes, in something that looked like freedom offered in an open hand, and she began to cry. "I know things," she whispered. "I have heard things. Mother and Nathaniel have been meeting. I heard them talking 3 nights ago. Planning." "Tell me everything," Clara said. And Maggie did. Standing in the shadow of the dressmaker's awning with tears running down her face and her voice shaking but not breaking, she told Clara about the meetings, about the gold coins from her father's safe, about the names of the men Nathaniel had hired to drive stolen cattle onto Eli's property in the dead of night, about her mother's instructions regarding the barn, about Nathaniel's calculated cruelty in turning over the very men he had hired to a deputy in Carter County afterward, using them as tools and then discarding them to cover his own tracks. Clara listened, and as she listened, she felt the structure of the conspiracy reveal itself like a building seen from above, every room visible, every hallway mapped, every weakness exposed. That afternoon, Clara went to the Blackwood house. She walked up the front steps of the largest home in Willow Creek and knocked on the door, and when the hired girl answered, she said, "Tell Mrs. Blackwood that Clara Crane is here, and that I will wait on this porch until she comes out or until the sun goes down, whichever happens first." Delilah came to the door. She stood in the doorway in a dress of dark blue silk, with her gray hair perfectly arranged and her face composed into an expression of polite impatience, the face of a woman who had been interrupted in the middle of something important by something she considered trivial. "Mrs. Crane," she said. "What a surprise." "I doubt that," Clara said. "I doubt anything surprises you, Mrs. Blackwood. I think you see everything coming from a very long way off, which is why I want to make sure you see this." She stepped closer, not into the house, just closer to the threshold, close enough that her words would not carry past the porch. "You think I am another mouse for you to chase out of your valley," Clara said. "Another Sullivan, another freedman, another family you can erase because they do not fit the picture you have painted of how this world should look." Delilah's expression did not change. Not a flicker, not a crack. The mask was perfect. "I am sure I do not know what you mean," she said. "I ran 1,200 miles to get here," Clara said, "from a man who locked me in rooms and tried to take everything I had. I did not run from him so I could be run off by you. I have nothing left to lose, Mrs. Blackwood. And a woman with nothing to lose is the most dangerous thing on this mountain. You should be afraid of that." Delilah looked at Clara for a long moment, and for the first time since they had met, the mask slipped. Just a fraction. Just enough for Clara to see behind it. And what she saw was not anger or contempt or the cold calculation she had expected. It was recognition. Delilah Blackwood recognized in Clara the same thing Clara had recognized in Eli's scar. Something forged in fire. Something that would not break because it had already been broken and rebuilt into something harder. The mask came back, smooth and seamless as glass. "Good day, Mrs. Crane," Delilah said, and she closed the door. Clara turned and walked back down the steps. She had not come here to win a confrontation. She had come to deliver a message, and the message was simple. "I am not afraid of you, and you should be afraid of that." Day 3. She found Tom Rollins. He was in the saloon. Back table, half-empty whiskey glass, the look of a man who had sold something important and was trying not to think about the price. He was young, maybe 28, thin and weathered by wind and work and the particular kind of poverty that grinds a man down to nothing without the courtesy of killing him outright. Clara sat across from him without asking permission. He looked up, startled. His eyes were red-rimmed and bloodshot, and they darted around the room before settling on Clara's face with the nervous focus of a rabbit who has just noticed the shadow of a hawk. "How much did Nathaniel Hale pay you to lie?" she asked. Rollins flinched, looked around again, looked back. "I do not know what you are talking about." $50, Clara said. "That is the going rate for a man's life, apparently. Tell me, Mr. Rollins, when they hang an innocent man on your testimony, will that $50 buy you a night's sleep?" He did not answer. But his eyes wavered. Something behind them shifted. Not conscience, exactly. Something more animal than that. The instinct of a small creature sensing that the ground beneath it was less solid than it appeared. "I am not threatening you," Clara said. "I am asking you to think about what you are doing." My husband never stole a head of cattle in his life. You know that. Nathaniel Hale knows that. Everyone in this town knows that. The only question is whether $50 is worth another man's neck. She stood up. She did not wait for an answer because she knew an answer would not come. Not here. Not now. The seed was planted. Whether it grew was up to Rollins and whatever remained of his conscience after poverty and desperation had stripped everything else away. She was almost at the saloon door when Rollins spoke. He did not look up from his whiskey. His voice was barely above a whisper. $50 does not last long. Clara stopped. She did not turn around. No, she said. It does not. But a clear conscience lasts forever. She walked out, and she did not know if it was enough. She did not know if anything she had done in 3 days was enough. She had a pastor who used to be a gunfighter, a mayor's daughter who might have the courage to betray her own mother, and a drifter with a $50 conscience that might or might not hold up under the weight of a man's life. It was not much, but it was what she had. That evening on her way to the jail, Clara passed the church. The door was open. Inside, in the dimming light, she could see Nathaniel Hale sitting alone in a pew. His head was bowed, his hands were clasped in front of him. And he was talking, not praying, talking to someone who was not there. Clara stood in the doorway and listened, and for the first time she understood something that complicated everything. Nathaniel Hale did not hate her. He hated himself. He had put his brother in a mine and his brother had died. And if he could not save his brother's intended bride, then he was forever the man who killed Daniel Hale. His cruelty was not born from malice. It was born from a guilt so deep it had curdled into something poisonous. He was trying to atone. And when atonement was refused, the guilt turned to rage. And the rage turned to destruction. This did not forgive what he had done. It did not excuse the lies or the frame, or the arson, or the conspiracy. But it made it complicated in a way that simple hatred never could. And Clara filed that complication away in her mind because she had learned that understanding your enemy was more valuable than despising him. She walked to the jail. They gave her 10 minutes. Eli was behind bars. His face was bruised and his lips swollen. The other prisoners had not been kind to an accused cattle thief. His bandaged hands were worse, the wrappings dirty and stained, the burns underneath untreated for days in a cold cell. If tomorrow goes wrong, he said. His voice was quiet and steady, the way it always was when things were worst. Promise me you will leave. Take what money there is. Get on the first stagecoach heading anywhere and do not look back. Clara looked at her husband through iron bars. The man who had given her a floor to sleep on and a porch to freeze on. The man who had told her the truth about his dead wife's letter when a lie would have been safer. The man who had said, "I love you," as if the words themselves might kill him, but said them anyway because she asked. "I promise I will burn this whole town to the ground if they touch you," she said. Eli Crane, who had not smiled in days, who had been beaten and caged and accused of a crime planted by men who wanted to destroy him, looked at his wife through iron bars and smiled. The trial began at 9 in the morning in the Willow Creek Town Hall. A single room with wooden benches for the gallery and a raised platform for the judge, and an American flag hanging on the wall that looked like it had survived its own war. Judge Harrison sat at the front. Iron-haired and sharp-eyed, with the reputation of a man who was tough but fair and who had little patience for theatrics from either side. He had ridden in from the county seat the night before and had spent the morning reviewing the case file with the expression of a man who had seen better prepared prosecutions in his career, but was willing to let this one proceed on its merits. The jury was 12 men, farmers and shopkeepers and ranchers, men who worked hard and followed the law and did not have much patience for cattle thieves. Clara studied their faces from the front row and tried to read which ones had already made up their minds and which ones might still be reached. The prosecutor, a young lawyer named Daniels, who had been sent from the county seat along with the judge, was better than Clara had feared. He did not just present evidence. He painted a picture, and the picture he painted was devastating. Elijah Crane, he told the jury, a recluse, a man with a scar that speaks to a violent past, a man who lives alone 8 miles from town on a mountain where no one can see what he does, a man whose only alibi is his wife, married just days before his arrest, conveniently placing her testimony within the sphere of marital loyalty. And the cattle, 6 head bearing the Circle H brand, found right there on his property, not hidden, not disguised, sitting in his north pasture as if they belonged there. The evidence is clear, gentlemen, Daniel said. He stood before the jury with his hands clasped behind his back and his voice pitched to Carrie. This man is a cattle rustler, and the law requires that he pay the penalty. Clara sat in the front row with her hands clenched so tight her fingernails drew blood from her palms. Across the room, Eli sat at the defendant's table in handcuffs, his face unreadable. But Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, could see the way he kept his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, as if he were holding himself together by force of concentration. Tom Rollins took the stand. The thin young drifter with the weathered face and the $50 conscience walked to the witness chair, placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Then he lied. He told the jury he had seen Eli Crane driving Circle H cattle across the north pasture 3 nights before the arrest. He said he had been riding through on his way to the next town and had stopped to water his horse at the creek and had witnessed the whole thing from a distance of about 200 yards. Clara's heart sank. Her conversation in the saloon had failed. The seed she planted had not grown. $50 had purchased this man's conscience, and there was apparently no refund. The defense lawyer, an older man named Warren, who had agreed to take the case as a favor to Reverend Hayes, did his best with what he had. He called Mrs. Patterson, who testified she had heard riders passing through town at midnight, heading north toward Eli's property. He called a ranch hand who had seen Nathaniel meeting with strangers at the saloon. He called Clara herself, who sat in the witness chair with her hands folded and her voice clear and her eyes fixed on the jury as she testified under oath that Eli had been beside her in the cabin every night and could not possibly have moved 6 head of cattle without her knowing. The prosecutor cross-examined her with surgical precision. You love your husband, do you not? Of course, and you would say anything to protect him. I tell the truth to protect him, Clara said. That is what I am doing now. But the circumstantial evidence was piling up, and the jury's faces told Clara it was not enough. She could see the calculation in their eyes. The scarred mountain man, the cattle on his land, the convenient new wife. The story was too clean and too easy, and 12 men from a small town were going to take the easy road because the easy road was the one that did not require them to challenge the most powerful woman in Willow Creek. Clara looked at the clock on the wall, 2:17 in the afternoon. Time was bleeding out. Then the courtroom door opened. Margaret Blackwood walked in alone, uninvited, unannounced, wearing a plain dress with her hair pulled back and her face pale as paper. She looked nothing like the girl Clara had cornered outside the dressmaker's shop 2 days earlier. That girl had been frightened and uncertain and crying. This girl was something else. This girl had made a decision, John, that would burn down every bridge she had ever stood on and was walking across the last one with matches in her hand. She walked up the center aisle of the town hall with the quiet, deliberate steps of someone who has chosen a path and cannot turn back. Every eye in the room followed her, every breath held. Delilah Blackwood rose from her seat in the gallery, her mask cracked for the first time in front of an audience. Her voice came out sharp and raw, stripped of its usual honey. Margaret, sit down this instant. Maggie's voice shook, but it did not break. No, mother. 2 words. The 2 hardest words she had ever spoken, and they landed in that courtroom like a match landing in dry grass. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, my name is Margaret Blackwood. I would like to testify. The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison banged his gavel. Delilah Blackwood sank back into her seat with a face the color of chalk. Mayor Blackwood, sitting beside his wife, went very still. The stillness of a man who has just realized that the ground beneath his chair is no longer solid. Maggie took the stand. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore, and then she spoke in a voice that trembled but carried to every corner of the room. She told the court she had overheard her mother and Nathaniel Hale planning the entire operation. She told them about the $200 in gold coins taken from her father's safe to pay the men who would drive stolen cattle onto Eli's land. She told them the names of those men. She told them the dates. She told them the details with the specificity of someone who had been paying attention for a very long time, storing information the way a squirrel stores acorns against the winter she always knew was coming. And then she told them one thing more. My mother ordered the barn burned, she said. Her voice cracked, but she kept going. And afterward, Nathaniel told her about the men he had hired for the chum how he had turned them in to a deputy in Carter County to cover his tracks. He used them and threw them away. The courtroom went dead silent, the kind of silence that has weight and texture, the silence of a room full of people who have just heard something that cannot be unheard. Clara looked at Rollins. He was sitting in the gallery, and his face had gone the color of old snow. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He had just heard that Nathaniel Hale discarded the people who worked for him, turned them in, used them as tools, and then broke them when they were no longer needed. And Rollins was sitting in this courtroom as Nathaniel's star witness, the last piece holding the frame together. If Nathaniel would betray the men who burned the barn, he would not hesitate to betray the man who lied under oath. $50. And Rollins was expendable. Rollins raised his hand. "Your Honor, I need to say something." Judge Harrison looked at him over the rims of his spectacles. The courtroom held its breath. Rollins stood. He looked at Eli sitting in handcuffs at the defendant's table, and something shifted in his face. Not courage. He was not brave enough for courage. Fear. The primal fear of a man who has just realized that the machine he was part of will grind him up as easily as anyone else. "Nathaniel Hale paid me $50 to testify against Eli Crane," he said. His voice was flat and quiet and carried through the silent room like a stone skipping across still water. "Everything I said on the stand was a lie. I never saw Crane steal any cattle. I never saw him do anything wrong." He paused, and his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, but the room was so quiet that every person in it heard every word. $50 is not worth a man's neck. I am sorry." He sat down. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes. Clara sat in the front row and stared at the closed door of the deliberation room and did not move. She did not eat. She did not drink water. She did not speak. She sat and she waited, and she felt every minute of those 40 minutes pass through her body like blood through a vein, each one carrying with it the possibility that her husband would live or die. The door opened. The foreman stood, not guilty. Clara did not remember crossing the courtroom. She was in her seat, and then she was in Eli's arms, and he was still wearing handcuffs. But he held her anyway, pressing his face into her hair, and she was crying, and he was saying her name over and over, "Clara. Clara, Clara," as if the sound of it was the only prayer he knew. They uncuffed him, and when his hands were free, the first thing he did was take her face in his bandaged palms and look at her and say 2 words. "You did this. We did this," Clara said. "No." He shook his head. His eyes were bright and fierce and full of something that was bigger than gratitude and deeper than love. "You walked into a church and told a town to choose. You turned an enemy's daughter into an ally. You sat across from a man in a saloon and asked him to find his conscience. You did this, Clara. All of it." Maggie Blackwood sat alone in the courtroom after the verdict. Her mother had walked past her without a word. Not a scream, not a dramatic confrontation, not even a look, just silence. A man whose attempt at atonement had twisted into something monstrous. Because guilt, when it has nowhere to go, eats everything around it. "Claire," he called out. His voice broke on her name the way it had broken on his brother's name in the church 3 nights ago. "I am sorry. I just wanted to make it right with Daniel. I am sorry." Clara looked at Nathaniel Hale, and she saw the real man beneath the wreckage. She did not forgive him. Not then, perhaps not ever. But she understood, and understanding was its own kind of mercy. The kind that does not require absolution, but acknowledges the humanity even in those who have done terrible things. She helped Eli into the wagon. He was thinner and weaker than the man she had married just days ago. His hands were swollen and red and hot to the touch. Infection was setting in. She could see the angry streaks running up his wrists, and she knew that without treatment, he could lose those hands. She took the reins because he could not grip them. On the road home, climbing the mountain trail in the late afternoon light, he leaned his head against her shoulder and said, "Can you drive?" "Yes." "Good." Then he passed out. His body slumped against hers, heavy and warm, and trusting in the way only an unconscious person can be, and Clara held the reins in one hand and her husband with the other, and drove the wagon up the mountain without crying. She did not have time for tears. She had a man to keep alive. Josie Wheeler arrived before dawn the next morning with a doctor from the neighboring town, a quiet, competent man who took one look at Eli's hands and the red streaks climbing his arms and said, "We have about 2 days before this reaches his blood. 3 days of poultices and prayer, and the kind of precise patient work that separates a good doctor from a gravedigger. Clara did not leave Eli's side. She changed the bandages every 4 hours. She kept the fire burning. She spooned broth into his mouth when he was too weak to hold a cup. And she talked to him. Not about anything important. About the chickens and the weather and the way the creek sounded different when the ice started forming along the edges. She talked to keep him anchored to the world of the living because she had seen what happened when a man like Eli drifted too far into the dark. She had pulled him back from that edge once before on a night in a barn with a whiskey bottle, and she was not going to let him go now. The doctor saved his hands, but 2 fingers on his right hand lost sensation permanently. The nerves were dead. He could see his fingers move, but could not feel them. He dropped cups, fumbled buttons, could not grip the reins the way he used to. For a rancher, hands are everything. Losing feeling in 2 fingers was not a death sentence, but it was a wound that would never fully heal. Clara did not let him sit still long enough to feel sorry for himself. She put him to work the moment the doctor cleared him. Light tasks first, feeding chickens, shelling corn, tasks that forced his damaged hand to function without demanding the grip strength he no longer had. And while Eli relearned the basic mechanics of his own body, Clara ran the ranch. She did not help run it. She ran it, fed the cattle, mended the fences, negotiated prices with the trader who came through every 2 weeks. Josie Wheeler rode over 3 times a week and taught her everything. How to read the weather by the way the grass moved on the mountain. How to tell if a cow was sick by the way it held its head. How to fix a fence bump that had heaved in the frost. Clara discovered she was good at this. Better than good. She had spent 22 years believing she was fragile, dependent, unsuited for anything beyond the kitchen and the sewing room. The mountain taught her otherwise. The mountain did not care about propriety or social expectation. It only cared about competence. And Clara Bennett Crane, it turned out, was competent as hell. Maggie Blackwood lived with them through the winter. She slept on a pallet by the fire the way Clara had slept her first night in the cabin, and she learned to do things her wealthy upbringing had never prepared her for. The first time Maggie touched a cow, she screamed loud enough to spook every chicken in the coop. Clara laughed until she cried. It was the first time the cabin had held the sound of more than one person laughing, and the sound was so foreign to those log walls that it seemed to take a moment for the room itself to absorb it. But winter was not all laughter. The dark nights were long and the wind never stopped, and Eli grew quieter as the weeks went on. Not angry, just withdrawn. He sat for hours staring at his damaged hand, flexing the fingers he could no longer feel. And Clara could see him sliding into a place she recognized. The place where you start to believe you are a burden, where the voice in your head begins telling you that the people around you would be better off without you, where the weight of everything you have lost presses down so hard that standing up feels impossible. One night in deep February, Clara woke to find his side of the bed empty. She found him on the porch, sitting in the freezing dark, staring at the 2 crosses behind the cabin. The moonlight caught the frost on the grass and made the graves glow like something holy. She sat beside him, said nothing, waited. "Ruth died because I was not good enough," he said finally. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Now you are carrying everything because I am not strong enough. Maybe I should not have." Clara took his damaged hand, held it in both of hers, felt the 2 numb fingers dead to her touch but alive to her heart. "Do not," she said, "do not finish that sentence. You are not a hero, Eli. You are my husband. And my husband is allowed to be weak." He looked at her, and in the moonlight, with the cold wind cutting through both of them and the graves of his first family glowing in the frost, something in his face finally let go. Not the grief. The grief would never fully leave. It had become part of him, the way the scar had become part of his face, something earned and permanent that changed the shape of everything around it. But the guilt, the crushing certainty that he was responsible for every bad thing that had ever happened to the people he loved, that he let go. He leaned into her. She held him. And for the first time in all the months she had known him, she felt him shake with something that was not rage or cold or pain. He was crying, silently, the way men cry when they have been taught that tears are weakness and have to unlearn that lie, one painful drop at a time. She held him on the porch in the freezing dark and let him break. Because sometimes breaking is the first step toward mending. Maggie left in March. She took the stage to Denver with Miguel Reyes, the young wrangler, whose quiet courage had matched her own. Clara walked her to the gate of the property on the morning she left. Thank you, Maggie said, for showing me what a woman can be. Go, Clara said, and do not look back. Maggie climbed into the wagon and did not look back. Clara watched until the wagon disappeared over the ridge, and then she went inside and made coffee and started the day. Spring arrived in April with a violence that surprised her. One day the mountain was brown and dead, and the next it was exploding with color. Wildflowers she did not know the names of pushing up through the thawed earth, green grass running like water down the slopes, the creek behind the cabin swelling with snowmelt. Running high and fast and singing, Clara was hanging laundry on the line when she felt it for the first time, not the nausea. She had been ignoring that for a week, telling herself it was something she ate, something in the water, anything other than what she knew in the deepest part of herself it actually was. What she felt was certainty, the deep, wordless, bone-level knowledge that she was carrying a child. She stood in the spring sunshine with a wet shirt in her hands and felt terror and joy collide inside her like two trains meeting on the same track. She did not tell Eli. Not yet. She went to Josie Wheeler. Josie was in her garden turning earth with a spade when Clara rode up. The older woman took one look at Clara's face and set down her tool and said, "Sit down before you fall down." "I think I am pregnant," Clara said. Josie studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded. Her face was calm, but her eyes were full of something old and knowing and kind. "You are scared," she said. It was not a question. Terrified. Good. Scared means you know you have something worth losing. Now go home and tell your husband. Clara rode back to the cabin and found Eli in the corral working with a horse practicing his grip on the lunge rope with his damaged hand. He had been at it for weeks, retraining those fingers to hold and guide and control. Getting better. Slowly, but better. Eli. He turned, saw her face, set down the rope. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Clara said. And then she told him. He did not celebrate. He went pale. The color drained from his face the way it does when a man receives the news he has been most afraid of hearing. And Clara understood why. The last time Elijah Crane heard he was going to be a father, it ended with 2 graves behind the cabin and 5 years of living death. "This time is different," Clara said quickly. "I am not Ruth. You are not who you were 5 years ago. We have Josie nearby. We can get the doctor from the next town. We will be all right." Eli stood in the corral with his damaged hand at his side and his good hand gripping the fence rail so hard his knuckles went white. He looked at Clara. He looked at the cabin they had rebuilt. He looked at the 2 crosses behind it. Then he crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could feel his heartbeat hammering against her chest. And she felt him shake again. Not from grief this time, from something that had no word big enough to contain it. "We are going to have a baby," he said into her hair. His voice was rough and broken and full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby," Clara confirmed. "And we are going to be all right." Late summer. Clara, now visibly pregnant, carried wildflowers behind the cabin to the 2 crosses. She laid them on Ruth's grave first, white and yellow blossoms she had picked from the creek bank where the soil was richest. She arranged them carefully against the weathered wood, and then she sat down in the warm grass. She was alone. Eli was in the south pasture. Josie was at her own ranch. The mountain was quiet except for the wind and the creek and the birds that had returned with the warm weather. Clara sat beside Ruth Crane's grave and spoke to her. "Thank you," she said, "for loving him first, for teaching him how to love, for this cabin and this land and everything you built that I get to live in now." She put her hand on her belly where the baby was moving. "I promise I will take care of him, and I promise our baby will know your name. Grace Ruth Crane." That was the name she had chosen. Not just remembrance. Continuation. Ruth was not erased or replaced. She was woven into the new story, a thread of gold running through the fabric of everything that came after. Clara sat for a long time in the grass beside the 2 graves, and she felt something she had not expected to feel in a graveyard. Peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something larger than pain. The understanding that life is built on loss, that joy and grief are not opposites, but neighbors sharing a wall so thin you can hear one through the other. And that the bravest thing you can do is love someone knowing they might be taken away. The baby came in September during a thunderstorm that shook the cabin walls and lit the sky with lightning that turned night to day and back again. Josie summoned a week early by Eli, who was not summoned a week early by Eli, who was not taking chances. Not this time. Not ever again. The labor was long. 14 hours. Clara screamed and cursed and gripped Eli's hand so hard she thought she might break his good fingers too. And through it all, he sat beside her. He did not look away. He did not let go. When the baby came, she came screaming, red-faced and furious and perfect, with a cap of dark hair and her father's gray eyes. Josie lifted her and placed her on Clara's chest, and the baby stopped crying instantly, as if she had found the one place in the world she was meant to be. Eli looked at his daughter, the scarred mountain man who had dug 2 graves behind this cabin, who had spent 3 years living like a dead man walking, who had been broken by war and grief and rebuilt by stubborn choice and unexpected love. He looked at his daughter and his face transformed. "Hello, little one," he whispered. His voice cracked in the middle like a frozen creek giving way in spring. His damaged hand reached out 2 numb fingers and all, and touched the baby's cheek with a gentleness that made Clara's heart ache. "I am your father," he said, "and I promise you, I promise, I'm going to protect you and love you and make sure you grow up knowing how lucky we are that you are here." Grace Ruth Crane, 7 pounds 4 ounces. Born at 9:17 in the evening during the worst thunderstorm Willow Creek had seen in 20 years. Born to a woman who had died once on a staircase in Pennsylvania and decided to live again. And a man who had buried his heart in the ground and had it dug back up by a stranger with 17 cents. The cabin had been expanded over the summer. 2 new rooms and a wider porch built with lumber and labor donated by neighbors who had slowly and grudgingly and then willingly come around to accepting the Cranes as part of their community. Josie Wheeler had supervised the construction. Reverend Hayes had blessed the addition. Even Mrs. Patterson had come out with curtains she had sewn herself, though she pretended they were just something she had lying around. A letter had arrived in the spring, postmarked from the territorial prison in Laramie. 2 lines in Nathaniel Hale's handwriting. "I am not asking for forgiveness, but I want you to know Daniel would be glad you are happy. He always wanted you to smile more." Clara had read it, folded it, did not reply, but she did not burn it either. She put it in the wooden chest beside Ruth's baby shoes and the letter to Catherine that was never sent. The past was not erased, it was kept. All of it, the pain and the love and the grief and the guilt stored carefully in a dark chest the way you store seeds through winter, knowing that even the hardest things carry the possibility of new growth. Autumn evening. Grace was 3 weeks old and sleeping in the cradle Eli had built with his own hands, working slowly and carefully with his damaged fingers, fitting each piece together with the patience of a man who understood that the most important things cannot be rushed. The cabin was warm. A fire crackled in the hearth. The smell of bread hung in the air because Clara had baked that morning, the way she did every Sunday now. On the mantel, a tin cup held late-season wildflowers. Through the window, Clara could see the 2 crosses behind the cabin, and beside them the flowers she had planted in the spring. They were dormant now, waiting for next year. But they would come back. They always came back. Clara sat on the bed, exhausted and happy and sore and full of a contentment so deep it felt like it had always been there, just waiting for her to stop running long enough to find it. Eli stood in the doorway watching her. The firelight played across his scarred face and made the jagged line from ear to jaw look like something earned rather than something suffered. He was thinner than when she had first met him. His right hand would never fully work the same way again. But he was standing in the doorway of a home filled with bread and firelight and a sleeping baby and the woman who had told him to choose to live. And he was smiling. Not the rusty, cautious smile she had first seen months ago, a full smile, uncarded, radiant with the hard-won joy of a man who has crawled through darkness and come out the other side into light. Clara looked at him. "Where do I sleep?" she said. Her voice was soft and teasing, her eyes bright with love and mischief and the bone-deep knowledge that she already knew the answer. The same question she had asked on that first night, standing in this cabin with nothing but 17 cents and a broken watch and a secret she could not bear alone. Eli Crane crossed the room. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her. He reached down and pulled the blanket back. The same gesture he had made that first night when she was a stranger and he was a ghost. "Right here," he said. But this time he did not walk to the porch. He lay down beside her and pulled the blanket over them both, and Clara curled into his chest and listened to his heartbeat. Steady, sure. The sound of a man who had chosen to live and was living. The beat of it was regular as hammer strikes on wood, as hoofbeats on packed earth, as rain falling on the roof of a home they had built with their own scarred hands. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the grass the way it always did and always would. It passed over the two graves planted with flowers that would bloom again in spring. It swept past the new barn that Josie Wheeler's crew had raised in a single day, while Clara stood in the yard and wept at the kindness of it. It whispered through the cottonwood trees along the creek where Clara had poured out a bottle of whiskey on a night that felt like 100 years ago. And inside the cabin, in the warm gold light of the fire, a baby slept, and a woman breathed, and a man held them both, and the wind could not touch them. This story reminds us that home is not a place you find. It is a choice you make every single day with someone brave enough to stay. And sometimes the people most worth loving are the ones who have been broken the deepest because they know exactly what it costs to try again. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you chose to stay when it would have been easier to walk away? When was the last time someone said two words to you? I choose you, and you felt the whole weight of the world lift off your shoulders. When was the last time you looked at someone scarred and broken and saw not what they had lost, but what they still had to give? If this story meant something to you, take a second and hit that like button. It helps more than you might think. And if you know someone who is carrying something heavy in silence, someone who is running from something they are afraid to face, share this story with them. Sometimes a story is the nudge a person needs to stop running and start choosing. Subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss a story, and leave me a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. What time is it where you are right now? I read every single one. Where do I sleep? She asked. Right here, he answered. And for the first time in her entire life, Clara Crane did not need to ask where she belonged. She was already there. Because one honest choice turned a girl with 17 cents into a woman with a home. And it is never too late to choose a better way forward. But the following spring, when the flowers on Ruth's grave bloomed again and the mountain turned green from base to peak, a letter arrived from Pennsylvania. 4 words in handwriting Clara recognized immediately. The handwriting of a man she had pushed down a staircase on a November night that felt like another lifetime. Walter Griggs is alive, and he is coming. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters.